Basil raced through the darkness of Norvind, clutching his blood-soaked coat sleeve with his left hand. In his pocket, a bottle of medical alcohol and a roll of bandages jostled together. But he had no intention of stopping to treat the wound here and now. His mind was fixated on a single thought, like a beacon. Get out. Out of this forest. Back to the city. To people. The unbearable stench of torn-apart bodies still lingered in his nostrils. Even with his flashlight, Basil could barely make out the trail, stumbling more than once over roots, and nearly losing his only source of light. Without it, he'd be trapped in this cursed place until morning, immobilized by darkness, cold, and sheer terror. Although terror already gripped him from head to toe. When he finally emerged at the outskirts of town, spotting the first few houses, he nearly broke into tears. All that was left now was to drag himself to the hospital building where he was temporarily living. Upon reaching it, Basil pushed the door open and collapsed inside, as if he'd been thrown like a sack of potatoes. He stumbled into the doctor's lounge, immediately peeling off his coat and tossing it into a corner, followed by his blood-soaked shirt. His forearm bore the crimson imprint of a beast's bite, a row of bloody punctures stretching from his wrist to the crook of his elbow. Thankfully, the veins had been spared. Basil fished the alcohol and bandages from his coat pocket, cleaned the wound, administered a rabies shot just in case, and then wrapped the injury. He pulled on a clean shirt, burned the bloodied clothes in the backyard, and returned inside. Opening a bottle of vodka, a gift from Lieutenant Karazin, damn him, he took a deep swig. Only when the alcohol began to warm his insides did he collapse onto the couch to process everything that had just happened. Since arriving in Nakhtumirsk, people had warned him about a fearsome werewolf that terrorized the townsfolk, but he had dismissed it as local folklore. Now, though, he'd encountered the creature himself, an enormous anthropomorphic beast covered in black fur, standing over 7 feet tall, with arms as thick as tree trunks. No wonder the commissioner had sent 3 soldiers to hunt it down. But the beast had torn them apart with such ease that it might as well have been shredding rag dolls. And Basil? The thing had only bitten his arm. Yes, now he was sure it had merely bitten him, because it could have easily torn it clean off and vanished back into the dark forest. If the legends were true about the werewolf's existence, then the rest of the story was likely true too. Anyone bitten by the creature would turn into a beast themselves by the next night. Basil glanced at the clock. 5 a.m. winter meant early darkness. He had about 12 hours. He let out a desperate cry, clutching the silver locket that hung around his neck. Opening it, he gazed at the portrait of a beautiful young woman inside. Then he sprang to his feet, rushed to the desk, grabbed a sheet of paper, and dipped his pen into the inkwell. For a moment he hesitated. Dearest Vicinia. No, too familiar. Basil crumpled the page and tossed it aside, grabbing another. Dear Vicinia, I write to you now to finally confess my feelings. It was no coincidence that I requested a post in Nakhtumirsk, though I could have easily stayed in the capital. The truth is... He didn't finish. The door creaked open and in walked Dr. Ringo Daimirov, his new supervisor. Seeing Basil, Daimirov stopped in the doorway, staring at him in astonishment. Oh, Basil, you're back. Good morning. Daimirov was already old, the fine lines of wrinkles accentuating his almond-shaped eyes. Perhaps that was why he had requested an assistant. His retirement was overdue. Daimirov moved toward the coat rack, starting to undress. Did you catch the werewolf? Basil tucked his bandaged arm deeper into his sleeve, hiding it. Who knew how people would react if they found out the creature had bitten him? Daimirov was a rational man who didn't believe in myths. But he was an Uln, and the local folklore was practically ingrained in their culture. It caught us, Basil replied. What happened? Basil recounted how the werewolf had ambushed them, ripped the 3 soldiers to pieces, and vanished. He didn't mention the bite, claiming instead that he'd panicked and fled, which was why he'd survived. Damirov immediately stepped closer and placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "I understand. Any sensible person would have done the same. You've been through a lot," Damirov said, nodding toward the vodka on the table. He fetched 2 aluminum cups from the cabinet, pouring a small measure for each of them. They clinked their cups together and drank. "Doctor, tell me about this mythical creature," Basil asked. "Where did it come from? I've only heard that it roams Norvind, nothing more." "The Ulni believe a werewolf is a man who transforms into a wolf at night. They serve Tendris, the local moon god." "And how does someone become such a creature?" "They say Tendris marks his servants in some way. But what that mark is, no one knows except for them. A bite? Come now. Half the townsfolk here are hunters. They're all scarred from animal bites and scratches. Norvind has wolves, bears, anything can happen. But yes, the initiation ritual for Tendris' servants is said to involve a werewolf's bite. I'm a man of science, as you know. It could be that its saliva contains some unknown virus. Hard to say. I've never seen the creature myself. But you've examined everyone in town. Haven't you found anything unusual? What would I look for? Birthmarks? Burns? Everyone has something unique to them. Basil sighed and took another swig of vodka. Do the legends say anything about a cure? Supposedly you must find the werewolf that bit you before sunset, cut out its heart and burn it. What a nightmare. Well, of course, it's a pagan legend. They only say that everyone the werewolf kills is a sacrifice to Tendris. So you understand he's no benevolent god. Dr. Damirov finished the last of the vodka in his cup in one gulp, sniffed his sleeve, and rose from his chair. Well, Basil, you should rest today. I can see you're exhausted. You need some sleep. Basil nodded. Strangely, the alcohol hadn't really gone to his head, just made him feel a little drowsy. So he dragged himself over to the couch, collapsed onto it, and fell asleep instantly. The sound of boots on the wooden floor of the doctor's lounge woke him. Basil cracked his eyes open. It was already daylight, and 2 committee soldiers, rifles slung over their shoulders, were standing over him. "Good morning, Dr. Rykov," one of them greeted. "Sergeant Rachmanin. Commissioner Dragunin has ordered you to report to him immediately." "Very well. Let me get myself together." Basil washed up, combed his hair, changed into clean clothes, grabbed his pocket watch, and donned his coat and ushanka before following the soldiers to the commissioner. He had expected to be summoned. After all, he was the only one who had returned from the night expedition, so it was him who would have to answer for it. They put Basil into a car, one of the few in the area, and drove him straight to the building housing the city committee for safety. They passed through the new center of Nakhtumirsk, allowing Basil to admire the beauty of its modern architecture. The Ulni built dreary wooden houses, but here, stone grandeur, height, and scale. Ornamental moldings, wide windows, little balconies. The Rus population in Nakhtumirsk was still small, less than a quarter of the town, and consisted mainly of officials, engineers sent to work at the local pulp and paper mill, teachers, and committee members. All were assigned apartments here in the new district. Basil was also due to receive his own housing soon. Responsible for the city's safety was Commissioner Valerian Dragunin. He commanded a force of 200 soldiers, 3 of whom he'd already lost. Basil had found him entirely unsuited for such a position even yesterday, thin, curly-haired, with sparse, wispy mustache that made him look less masculine and more like a teenage boy. As if he were 18, rather than 30, his actual age. Too young, Basil had thought. And Dragunan's soft voice didn't help, completely unsuited for a commander. When Basil was brought into his office, the commissioner was studying some papers with a pensive look. Basil glanced at the clock. 11 already. He had at best 5 or 6 hours left. Suppressing his anxiety, he stood straight and tall, clasping his hands behind his back. "Good morning, Dr. Rykov," the commissioner greeted without looking up from the papers. "Please have a seat." Basil sat down in the chair opposite Dragunin, who set the papers aside and turned his full attention to him. "I was informed this morning that you returned from the night expedition, but my men did not. What happened out there? I'm afraid you won't believe me. We'll see about that. Start talking and we'll sort it out." The commissioner's soft voice clashed with his sharp, no-nonsense manner of speaking. Basil unbuttoned his collar, loosening it as it suddenly felt too tight around his neck. "The local legends turned out to be true. The werewolf exists. I saw it with my own eyes." "Is that so?" Dragunin's voice betrayed no hint of surprise. "Go on. It killed your men. I'm very sorry. And how did you escape?" "I ran while it was preoccupied with them. I'm deeply ashamed of my cowardice, but better shame than death." The commissioner frowned. "Sergeant, leave us alone with the doctor." The soldiers left the room. Dragunin clasped his hands on the desk, staring at them as if holding something dangerous. "I hope you understand how bad your story sounds." His voice, though soft, grew firmer. "You're a man of science, rational by nature. Tell me what's easier to believe, that a magical creature called a werewolf exists, or that you killed my men and are now trying to feed me a tale to cover it up?" Basil choked on the words forming in his throat, then began silently opening and closing his mouth like a fish, unable to find a response to such an absurd accusation. "I can take you to our camp," he finally managed. "You'll find the bodies and see for yourself that no man could have done such a thing. The werewolf tore them apart, literally into pieces." I don't know. You're a doctor. You're capable of many things." The commissioner rose from his chair and began pacing the room, eventually coming to stand behind Basil. "The bodies, or what's left of them, will need to be sent for examination. Here, the only one who could conduct such an examination besides you is Dr. Dymirov, who may very well cover for his new assistant. For a proper, independent analysis, they'll need to be sent to Nepryansk. Well, in the meantime, you'll sit here under lock and key. If the experts confirm it wasn't a person who did this, you'll be released immediately." Basil flinched, imagining what would happen when he turned into a werewolf in his cell later that night. A chill swept through him, a symptom of the transformation creeping closer. Unintentionally, he touched his forehead, which felt frighteningly cold. It seemed he'd have to lay all his cards on the table. "Fine. I have proof." Basil rolled up his sleeve, revealing the bandaged arm to the commissioner. Carefully, he unwrapped it, exposing the werewolf's bite marks. The commissioner let out a low whistle. "Looks like you ran into a bear. Well, all right. Let's say I believe you. What now?" "The legends say that a werewolf is a person who transforms into a beast at night." Basil rewrapped his arm as he spoke. "We need to figure out who it is. Dr. Dymirov mentioned that this mythical creature serves the local pagan god Tendris and bears some kind of mark. But I don't know what that mark is." The commissioner sank back into his chair, lost in thought. "I don't believe in all these fairy tales," he said. "But I admit it could be an elaborate trick, a con artist's ruse. There are two possibilities. Either a wild, dangerous animal is lurking in the forest and must be hunted down, or there's a murderer in the city who needs to be caught and brought to justice." "Sergeant." A few seconds later, the soldier who had escorted Basil, Sergeant Rachmanin, entered the office. "Take 5 men and head into the forest," the commissioner ordered. "You're to recover the bodies of our fallen comrades. The doctor will mark the location on the map for you. Here, doctor, please." "Yes. Circle it with a pencil." "There you go, Sergeant. Bring the bodies back to the city and deliver them to Dr. Daimirov for examination." "Is that clear?" "Understood." The sergeant left the office, closing the door behind him. "Now, Doctor, we'll investigate the possibility of a human culprit." The commissioner rose from his chair and walked over to a wardrobe. "I'll need you in case an examination is required. As for the mark, we'll ask Mogai, the local shaman. He knows more about these Tendrians than anyone else." The commissioner donned a winter officer's coat, fastened the belt with a revolver holster, and even attached a saber to his side. Basil couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the sight. Who still wore those? The oversized coat hung on the commissioner like a sack, making him look more like a schoolboy than an officer. They drove to the shaman's hut together. As they left the new part of the city and entered the old, Basil saw the true Nakhtumirsk in daylight for the first time. A battered rural road wound between wooden shacks covered in snow, making them resemble dugouts. The gray village houses blurred into a single indistinct patch, and it seemed as though there had been no real life here before the blacks came to power, just endless wilderness. Dogs barked at the car from every yard as they passed. Along the way, the commissioner struck up a conversation, sharing details about the town. The population was small, just over 4,000. There was only one school, built just 10 years ago. The same went for the hospital. Before it was constructed, Dr. Daimirov had treated patients in his own home. Apart from Daimirov and Basil, there were no other doctors in the city. The local Ulni mainly lived off hunting, fishing, and reindeer herding. Some worked at the factory, which had also been established only a decade ago. The commissioner had been assigned 5 years earlier. Basil learned that Dragunin had joined the army at 18, fought in the Riemann War, and earned a medal for bravery after being wounded in battle. "And you, Doctor? What brought you here?" "I wanted to get as far from the capital as possible." Basil unconsciously began rubbing the locket around his neck. "A woman?" The commissioner's voice carried a trace of sympathy. "I see. I'd rather not talk about it." Mogai's hut stood on the outskirts, far from the rest of the town, almost at the edge of the Norvind wilderness. The car couldn't make it all the way, so they had to walk part of the journey. Deep snowdrifts and a biting wind made the trek difficult. After about 10 minutes, they were greeted by the barking of Mogai's dog, which darted out of its kennel as they approached the hut. To Basil's surprise, however, the dog didn't attack them. Instead, it greeted them warmly. At least it enthusiastically bounded up to the commissioner, who crouched down with a smile to scratch the dog behind the ear. "I've always gotten along well with dogs," he explained. After playing with the dog for a moment, they entered the hut. Mogai lived modestly, with little furniture, and even slept on the floor atop a simple mattress. It might be fine in the summer, Basil thought, but didn't he freeze in the winter? Still, the house had a stove, and Mogai was currently stoking its coals with a poker. Basil's attention, however, was drawn to the shelves neatly lined with jars of various herbs and mushrooms. He also noticed a basket of dried fly agarics in the corner and smirked knowingly. Mogai himself was short, wiry, and deeply wrinkled. His weathered skin was flushed red from exposure, and his long, ash-colored hair was tied into 2 braids. What surprised Basil most was his attire, a traditional long dress worn by Uln women. "What do you want?" Mogai's voice was unexpectedly powerful for such a small frame. "I'd like to introduce you to the new doctor," the commissioner said. "This is Basil Rykov. Basil, meet Mogai, our local shaman." "A pleasure." Basil offered a faint bow, unsure whether it was the appropriate gesture. "May Tendris guide you through the darkness," the shaman replied. "A beast, supposedly a werewolf, attacked the doctor last night. It even bit him on the arm. Show him, doctor, thank you." The commissioner gestured for Basil to roll up his sleeve. "According to your legends, this creature is a person who transforms into a wolf at night, a servant of Tendris, marked by him in some way. Can you tell us more about this?" Mogai finally tore himself away from his stove, set the poker down, and approached Basil. He grabbed Basil's arm roughly, inspecting the bandages, turning it over, and then looked him directly in the eyes. "My sympathies," the shaman said earnestly. "This is a heavy burden." "So, what about Tendris?" the commissioner reminded him. "I know what you're looking for," Mogai said. "Igor Agzunov came to me a few hours ago. His dog died 3 days ago, and he hasn't gotten a new one yet. You might want to pay him a visit." "Interesting," the commissioner mused. "A unique case." Basil couldn't figure out what was so unique about someone's dog dying, but the commissioner seemed to think it was of great importance. So Basil decided not to ask any questions for now. At least not in front of the shaman. He didn't want to seem completely clueless. "Thank you for the lead," the commissioner said. "We'll look into it." After bidding Mogai farewell, they left the hut and returned to the car. Only after they were seated with the engine running did Basil finally work up the courage to speak. "Forgive me, Commissioner, but I don't understand," he admitted honestly. "What about the dog? What's going on?" "Local beliefs," the commissioner explained. "You've noticed that all the Olni keep dogs? They believe dogs are the younger brothers of wolves, and by caring for them they honor Tendris. Werewolves rarely attack the Olni, and they think it's because of their dogs. Personally, I think it's nonsense. As for Igor Agzunov, he's a local hunter, and I know him well. He never goes anywhere without his dog. The fact that he hasn't replaced it after 3 days is, at the very least, suspicious. Either way, it's worth checking out." Basil found this explanation far from satisfying. A hunter's dog had died. So what? Why waste time on this when they urgently needed to find the werewolf? The clock was ticking and the sun was racing toward the western horizon. Meanwhile, dogs barked from every yard as their car passed, drowning out even the roar of the engine. The vehicle shook violently on the bumpy road, but the commissioner drove with confidence, never stopping to ask for directions. Did he know all the town's residents by name? Then again, it wasn't surprising. His job required it. They soon arrived at an unassuming one-story house surrounded by a low wooden fence. A round-faced Uln man sat on a wooden bench near the gate, smoking a long pipe. Basil couldn't guess his age. He could have been 30 or 50. "Good day, Igor," the commissioner called out. "Why the long face?" "Good day, Commissioner," the man replied. "I could tell you, but you wouldn't understand." "Why wouldn't I? I'm a pretty understanding guy. By the way, meet Basil Rykov, our new doctor." "Igor Agzunov," the Uln said, shaking Basil's offered hand with a firm, confident grip. "So, what's the trouble?" "My dog, Lakish, died a few days ago. I was going to go to the Shagorovs to get a new one. They had a litter about 6 months ago. But my daughter started acting up. She says she doesn't want a dog. Strange girl. I don't recognize her anymore." "What do you mean?" "It's like she's not my daughter at all. like she's been swapped for someone else. Basil observed Igamore's trembling fingers and unfocused eyes staring off into the distance. He remembered reading a paper by a Western psychiatrist about 4 years ago that described a syndrome where people failed to recognize their loved ones. What was the doctor's name? Something that sounded like Karga. No matter. Agzunov clearly needed help, but Basil didn't know the cause of the disorder or how to treat it. "We'll look into it," the commissioner assured him. "We'll talk to Perugia." Agzunov nodded and continued smoking, staring distantly into the horizon. The commissioner opened the gate and headed toward the house with Basil following. "He needs help," Basil said quietly as they walked along the path. "He has a serious psychological disorder." "Maybe," the commissioner replied. "Or maybe something else is going on here. Let's talk to the girl and find out." The commissioner unceremoniously opened the door and stepped inside. They found themselves in a bright, spacious entryway, and the commissioner immediately moved further in. There, in a cramped kitchen, a girl of about 13 sat watching a pot of water slowly come to a boil on the stove. When the commissioner and doctor entered, she flinched in fear, turned and stared at them in astonishment, her eyes darting back and forth between the two. "Hello, Perugia," Dragunin greeted her. "Do you know who I am?" "Uh-huh," the girl nodded. "You're the commissioner." "Exactly, and this is our new doctor, Basil Rykov." "Hello, we've met before, haven't we?" The girl nodded again. "Met before?" the commissioner asked, surprised. "Yes," Basil replied. "The day after I arrived, I started the scheduled health exams for the school children. So I've met most of the kids already. Perugia has excellent health." "I remember that." The doctor gave the girl a kind smile, which she returned. The commissioner narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Excellent, you say?" His tone carried a feigned attachment. "Tell me, Perugia, do you remember your father's name?" "Igomore?" "Correct. And do you know the name of our town?" "Nakhtimirsk." "Very good. How about the country?" The commissioner continued his questioning, as though hoping to catch her in a lie or a mistake. He seemed to be probing for any hint of falsehood. Basil stood by, baffled. It was obvious to him that the girl was perfectly fine, healthy and completely ordinary. He had personally examined her just 2 days ago, yet with each of her correct answers, the commissioner's frown deepened. "All right, Perugia," Dragunin finally said, waving a hand dismissively. "It seems everything's fine with you. Goodbye, and stay well." The commissioner was standing near the stove, close to the girl. As he turned to leave, his elbow struck a pot of boiling water, knocking it over. The pot tipped, sending scalding water cascading toward Perugia. She yelped and jumped back, but not before some of the water splashed onto her arm. She immediately wrapped the injured limb in a cloth, as though trying to stop bleeding. But burns don't work like that, Basil thought, rushing to help. "Let me see your arm," he demanded, reaching toward her. "It's fine," she said firmly. "You were scalded. That's not fine. Don't worry. It barely touched me. It doesn't even hurt anymore." Then, suddenly, the commissioner stepped forward. The sound of a revolver's hammer cocking cracked through the air, and Basil froze as Dragunin leveled his weapon at Perugia. "Show the doctor your arm," Dragunin ordered coldly, "or I'll shoot you." Basil immediately placed himself between the girl and the gun, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Move," Dragunin barked, and his tone was so commanding that Basil stepped aside without thinking. "Show us your arm, you creature. I'm counting to 3. 1, 2. Perugia let out a shriek that was neither girlish nor human. Basil and Dragunin stood frozen as her mouth opened wide, revealing elongated fangs. The whites of her eyes flooded with blood, and claws sprouted from her fingers. The cloth she'd used to cover her arm fell to the floor, revealing smooth, unblemished skin, free of any burns. In the next instant, Perugia hurled herself through the window, shattering the glass with her body. Outside, she landed on her feet and took off running down the road toward the forest. Dragunin clicked his tongue in frustration and holstered his revolver. "After her," he commanded. "We're not letting that thing escape." The broken window and the fleeing girl felt surreal to Basil, like fragments of a bizarre dream. None of it made sense. The commissioner threatening Perugia with a revolver, her blood-red eyes, her fangs, it was too much. He began to wonder if the legendary curse of the werewolf was already taking hold, poisoning his mind. Igor Agzunov burst into the room, shivering as the cold wind swept in through the broken window. "May Tendris protect us," he murmured. "So the legends are true." Dragunin ignored the hunter and headed for the door. Basil remained rooted to the spot, turning this way and that, unsure of what to do. At the threshold, the commissioner called out to him, snapping him back to reality. Basil followed reluctantly. As they climbed into the car, Igor ran out of the house with a rifle in hand. "I'm coming with you." "Igor, it's dangerous," Dragunin warned. "She's my daughter." "She's not your daughter anymore." "I don't care." "I know Norvind better than anyone." "Fine. Get in." The commissioner started the car, turned it around, and drove in the direction of the forest, following Perugia's tracks in the snow. Basil's mind churned with questions, but he held them back, though curiosity and fear gnawed at him. This whole ordeal was far beyond anything he had expected. Moving to Noctumursk had been stressful enough, but a werewolf, Perugia, this was too much. He felt like he was losing his grip on who he was and what he was doing here. He had come seeking a quiet life, far from the chaos and great problems of the world. Instead, he'd stumbled into a nightmare he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "What's happening?" Basil finally asked, his voice distant and shaky. "The girl we saw, that wasn't Perugia Agzunov. That was a Yola. In our terms, a demon or malevolent spirit that takes on someone's appearance. Yola devour people and replace them." What nonsense is this? Basil couldn't believe that Dragunin, a man from the Black Army, a war veteran, could seriously spout such absurdities. "Is this another local legend?" "You saw it yourself, Doctor. Trust your eyes." Soon their car passed the edge of the town, and the road ended. A trail of small footprints led through the pristine snow, disappearing into the depths of the forest. "We're here," the commissioner announced, turning off the engine. "We go on foot from here?" They stepped out of the car, and Basil inhaled the crisp, frosty air, which helped clear his head. His thoughts began to steady, and his heart rate calmed. Dragunin carefully stepped into the snow, sinking almost to his knees. He gritted his teeth, raised his other leg, and took another step. "Leave it," Basil said. "You'll sink into the snow, soak through, and catch a cold. It's freezing. We're not going to catch her." "We must," the commissioner replied through clenched teeth. "Opportunities like this come once in a century." Agzunov hesitated briefly, then followed Dragunin into the snow. Basil stood and watched as they struggled through the deep drifts, their feet barely making progress. Meanwhile, Perugia's shallow tracks indicated that she had run across the snow as if it were solid ground. They would never catch her. Basil remembered the moment he had seen her inhuman face and heard that infernal screech. He realized that the chill outside wasn't as cold as the one inside him. What had the commissioner called her? Yola? And they eat people? That means the real Perugia Agzunov was already dead. At last, Basil understood. Dragoonin, noble and selfless, was doing everything in his power to protect people from an unknown menace. The hunter Agzunov was driven by a desire to avenge his daughter's death. But what was Basil, a doctor, doing here? He had his own problems. The aching wounds on his arm were a constant reminder that he needed to find the werewolf, and Perugia was clearly not it. On the other hand, the display he had witnessed made it clear that Yola possessed inhuman strength. Dragoonin and Agzunov could be seriously hurt in a confrontation, and they would need someone to provide first aid. Duty outweighed personal concerns. Basil stepped into the snow, following his companions. They trudged onward, carving a new path through the drifts. In the forest, the tracks eventually led to a narrow trail, making the journey easier. However, a new challenge arose. The trees grew closer together, threatening to close in and form an impenetrable wall. "My world has fallen apart, and you haven't even batted an eye," Basil said to Dragoonin, who was leading the way, eyes fixed on the tracks. "And you interrogated Perugia so strangely, as if you knew all along this would happen. Admit it, Commissioner, you knew from the start." "Yes," Dragoonin admitted without turning around. The single word carried a note of guilt. "Then why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? I've known about the Yola and Nakhtamirsk for a long time, but distinguishing a real person from an imposter is almost impossible. Yola mimic every habit, memory, and mannerism. You can't catch them out in an interrogation. That's why I took the risk of scalding her with boiling water. The one thing they can't hide is their remarkable ability to heal instantly." "And now what?" "We follow her to their lair. Once a month on the night of the new moon, the Yola gather for a feast, devouring all the people they've taken. Tonight is one such night. That's why I said this opportunity comes once in a century. Not only do we have a lead on where the Yola are likely hiding, but it's also the very day they gather. We could wipe them all out in one strike. And if not all, we'll at least learn who they are." "Why the new moon?" "It's the night when the eye of Tendris, their mortal enemy, is closed." "And what about Agzunov? His dog died, leaving the house unprotected. Dogs aren't much of a barrier to a hungry Yola, but these creatures avoid them anyway. That's why all the Ulni keep dogs. Most of them don't even remember why. They think it's to protect themselves from werewolves." "And who's the werewolf?" "A warrior of Tendris. They hunt and destroy Yola to protect ordinary people." Behind them, Agzunov let out a sharp hiss. The hunter had been silent the whole way, and Basil had almost forgotten he was there. What was he thinking as he listened to Dragoonin's explanation? "Something wrong, Igomor." "Those are Mogai's tales," Agzunov said darkly. "And you believe them, Commissioner? That the killer of our loved ones is helping us?" "You can't be sure whether those people were human or disguised Yola," Dragoonin replied. "Exactly, I can't be sure. But I've known many of the dead my whole life. And now I'm supposed to believe they were Yola?" The Commissioner shrugged. The tracks eventually led to a tall pine tree where they abruptly ended. Dragoonin inspected the tree closely, noting claw marks and gouges in the bark. "Looks like she climbed up and continued jumping from branch to branch." "Is that even possible?" Basil asked, astonished. "For a Yola it is," Dragoonin replied. "She realized we were tracking her and decided to throw us off the trail." "And how do we know where to go now?" The Commissioner surveyed their surroundings, grunted with satisfaction, and turned left. "Why that way?" Basil asked. Most branches are covered with snow, but the ones she landed on are either bare or have noticeably less snow on them. You can see it most clearly in that direction, so logically that's where we need to go. In some places, dense underbrush blocked their path, forcing Dragoonin to unsheathe his saber and hack at the branches to move forward. After 300 yards, they crossed a ravine and clambered over a pile of fallen trees. At that point, both Basil and Aksunov wanted to give up, but Dragoonin firmly declared, "We must," and scrambled over the obstacles. An hour later, their clothes were caked with snow and dirt, and Basil's palms were raw, despite his good leather gloves. He feared they had gone too deep into Norvind and wouldn't be able to find their way back. But the commissioner reassured him that he could navigate them out easily. The canopy of trees closed above them, blocking the sky, and the bright daylight was slowly smothered by encroaching evening darkness. Basil felt his chills intensify and suspected he might be running a fever. As they approached another thicket, Dragoonin abruptly halted, crouched, and raised a fist, signaling the others to stop. He carefully parted the branches, and Basil peeked over his shoulder. On a wide, snow-covered clearing ahead, they saw Perugia, or rather the thing she had become. She no longer resembled a normal human. Her mouth stretched nearly from ear to ear, her skin had turned gray, and her elongated arms and legs were grotesquely disproportionate to the rest of her body. Her clothes were torn in places, but the Yola didn't seem to feel the cold at all. Perugia was performing some sort of ritual. She slashed a vein on her left arm with her claw, let her blood drip onto the snow, and muttered something under her breath. "Pass me the rifle, Igor," Dragoonin whispered. "We'll take her out now." But before the commissioner could act, Aksunov unshouldered his rifle and aimed it at Dragoonin. The commissioner noticed and raised his hands, slowly rising to his feet. Basil instinctively took a few steps back, realizing he wasn't seen as a threat. "I'm here, Perugia," Aksunov shouted loudly. "Your father is here." The Yola immediately stopped whispering and turned to face them. "What are you doing, Igor?" Dragoonin growled through gritted teeth. "That creature will kill us all." "Shut up!" the hunter roared, punctuating his words with a gunshot. The commissioner cried out and fell to the ground. Basil seized the momentary confusion to lunge at the hunter, trying to wrest the rifle from him. But Aksunov struck him in the jaw with the butt of the weapon. The world spun. Light turned to darkness with flashes of fire. The pain was distant. Basil's consciousness slipping away as his body collapsed into the snow. Aksunov, meanwhile, emerged from the cover directly toward the Yola. "Don't be afraid, my girl," he shouted. "I've dealt with them. They won't hurt you anymore." The Yola, now looking exactly like Perugia again, ran up to him. "Thank you, Daddy," it said, wrapping its arms around the hunter's neck. In the next instant, the Yola ripped Aksunov's head from his body and sank its teeth into the torn neck. Blood splattered across the girl's face as grotesque, wet sounds of feasting echoed through the forest. Basil came to and saw the creature tearing chunks of flesh from the hunter's corpse with its teeth. His stomach twisted as if clutched by an iron fist, but he fought back the nausea, sprang to his feet, and ran toward Dragoonin. Survival instincts drove him now. If he didn't act, the Yola would devour him too. His only option was to grab a weapon and fight. But the creature bounded forward in 2 leaps, blocking his path. Basil screamed, throwing up his arms as if they could protect him. The Yola hissed ferociously and lunged at him, but stopped suddenly. A steel saber blade jutted from its open mouth. Dragoonin had regained consciousness and saved Basil at the last moment. The Yola, however, wasn't finished. With a sharp movement, it let the blade slice through half its head and turned, slashing at the commissioner with its claws. Dragoonin managed to leap back, but heard the whistle of claws slicing through the air. He swung the saber upward in a desperate attempt to fend off the creature, but it seemed unfazed by the strike. Black blood sprayed into the air as the Yola, now cleaved from its right side to its left shoulder, launched itself at Dragoonin and pinned him to the ground. The creature opened its gaping maw and sank its fangs into Dragoonin's shoulder. He screamed, struggling to push the Yola off, but it was futile. The monster drank greedily, slurping his blood. Then, abruptly, the Yola recoiled, smoke pouring from its mouth. It stared at its hands in confusion as its face began to melt from its skull. "You!" it roared furiously, glaring at Dragoonin. "It's you!" In the next moment, its head fell from its body and landed in the snow. The rest of its form crumpled to the ground. Exhausted and injured, Dragoonin lowered his saber, sheathed it, and stumbled to a nearby tree. Leaning his back against it, he slid to the ground. Basil rushed to his side. His face throbbed with pain, his head spun, and a strange ringing echoed in his skull, but his instincts as a doctor took over. The commissioner had done his duty. Now Basil had to fulfill his own. "Don't move," Basil instructed, beginning to unfasten Dragoonin's coat. The commissioner caught his hand. "No need. It will heal soon. You've got buckshot lodged in your shoulder. It needs to be removed, the wounds cleaned, and bandaged. And that creature bit you. You've lost a lot of blood. In this cold, that's deadly. We have to get you back to the city. But I don't think I can manage on my own. I have tweezers, alcohol, and bandages with me," Basil said. "I always carry them just in case. I need to at least give you some first aid so you can make it back on your own." "I'll make it," Dragoonin replied. "Don't worry. It's already getting late, you see." He pointed upward. Basil looked up, but had difficulty spotting the sky through the thick canopy of trees. It did seem to be getting darker. The doctor pulled out his pocket watch from under his coat. 4 o'clock, another hour, and it would be over. "You need to find your werewolf," Dragoonin said. "Why didn't you stay in the city? You could have." Basil fully unbuttoned the commissioner's coat and started working on his uniform. "Because I'm a doctor, and you might have needed help. Duty comes before personal problems." Dragoonin let out a strained laugh, which quickly turned into a wince of pain from his wounds. "I see. Yes, I suppose that's how it had to be. People like you and me have only one path. I'd forgotten. He chose you himself." "Who's he?" "Tendris." Basil, now unfastening Dragoonin's uniform jacket, paused momentarily. "It was me who bit you, Doctor," Dragoonin admitted. "I suspected as much." The commissioner smirked and closed his eyes. "Forgive me. Tendris commanded it. It's hard to explain, but I felt an overwhelming urge to do it. Apparently he decided I needed an assistant. But don't worry. You'll be fine. You won't turn." I won't?" Basil froze, his hands gripping the unbuttoned shirt collar. "Your silver locket," Dragoonin said. "Silver is the only thing that can wound a werewolf. Thankfully, there's little of it in Noctumursk. As long as you keep the locket on all night without taking it off, by dawn the curse will be gone without a trace. But it only works on the first night. If you transform, there's no going back. So, I just need to keep my locket on all night, that's it?" "That's it." Dragoonin smiled, and for some reason that smile deeply moved Basil. In that moment, the commissioner, a hardened soldier with a youthful face and thin, scraggly mustache, seemed profoundly kind and genuine. Looking at him now, it was impossible to imagine that this man had been waging a secret war against otherworldly creatures for years, with the people around him none the wiser. Basil finally exposed Dragunin's shoulder, pulled a small bottle of medical alcohol from his coat pocket, and poured some over the wounds. Then he disinfected the tweezers with the alcohol and began extracting the buckshot. Dragunin grimaced but endured the pain silently. "Once night falls, I'll transform, and the wounds will heal instantly." "You're wasting your efforts," Dragunin said. "I doubt you want to keep buckshot lodged in your shoulder." "It would have been pushed out eventually, but thank you nonetheless." "I appreciate your concern. You're a good man, Doctor. Forgive me for having to kill those 3 in front of you. They were all Yola. That's why I sent them on the hunt in the forest. If I hadn't arrived in time, they would have killed and replaced you. That would have made my job even harder." "Then I'm glad you showed up in time," Basil replied. "Now hold still." Basil removed the last piece of buckshot, doused the wounds with alcohol again, and began bandaging them. "Wasting bandages," Dragunin muttered. "Better than you bleeding out before sunset. And let's not forget the risk of infection." "You're a doctor through and through," Dragunin said. "How did you end up in our backwater town?" Basil sighed deeply. Perhaps it was the moment, or maybe the day's events, but he found himself telling Dragunin everything. He spoke of how since childhood he had been in love with Ksenia Miranina, a classmate. How one summer he had picked flowers from the school garden, almost getting caught, just to give her a modest bouquet. How for years he hadn't been able to confess his feelings, as doing so felt like stepping into a black abyss. Maybe it wasn't deep, but the chance of a deadly fall was always there. Basil had been too careful with his emotions, guarding his fragile heart and chastising himself for his sensitivity and vulnerability. Eventually, it led to the inevitable. Ksenia fell in love with someone else, a soldier, of course. At the time, Basil was in his final year of university and doing a practicum at the base where this bold, handsome lieutenant, Iskander Kurazin, was stationed. Kurazin, decisive and commanding, confessed his feelings to Ksenia just a week after meeting her, and was met with mutual affection. Since Basil was friends with both, he had no choice but to watch their happiness, clenching his fists in frustration at everyone, and especially himself, for not being the one to kiss her instead of Kurazin. "And then," Basil continued, finishing the bandage and refastening Dragunin's coat, "a soldier deserted from the base. He took a rifle with him, and Kurazin tried to stop him. For his trouble, he took a bullet, right here just near the heart. The hospital was too far away. He would have bled out before they could get him there. He needed surgery on the spot. But the base doctor, my superior, was a hopeless drunk. That evening he was so intoxicated that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake him. You have to understand, Commissioner. At that moment," Basil continued, "I could have easily solved my problem. I had no right to operate. I was just an intern. Kurazin was on the brink of death, and I could have stayed by Ksenia's side to comfort her. Sure, my superior would have gone to prison, but he'd have deserved it. A doctor shouldn't drink himself into such a state." "But you saved him, didn't you?" Dragunin asked. "Yes," Basil admitted. The commissioner smiled. "That's why Tendris chose you. Selflessness. That's his mark. You and I, we do what's right not because we expect a reward. There won't be one. Most of the time, no one will even thank us. We do it because we can't act any other way. No matter how hard or painful it is, you'll shoulder it all because that's who you are." Basil nodded. "I don't mean to brag, but for an intern, I performed a brilliant operation. We made it look like my superior saved Kurazin. Otherwise, both of us would have faced consequences. But I couldn't stay there after that. I finished my studies and requested an assignment somewhere far away. That's how I ended up in Nakhtumirsk. It's fate, Doctor. And now? We wait for nightfall. From the looks of it, this is the entrance to the Yola's hidden lair, where they keep their captives for their feasts. When they gather, I'll attack and try to take them all down at once. If I succeed, I'll not only rid the town of them, but also save the captives. Maybe then the people of Nachtumursk will see that the werewolf isn't their enemy. A few years ago, I made a mistake. I let one Yola escape. Just one, Doctor. And I'm still paying for it. As you've seen, people can't accept that their loved ones might be man-eating monsters, even when it's right before their eyes. The Yola cloud their minds, make them willing to die for them. If it's not too much trouble, could you hide the Agzunov's bodies and cover the bloody tracks with snow? Basil spent the remainder of the daylight hours on the task. Despite his efforts, it wasn't perfect. A quick glance could tell someone had been there, but not who. Satisfied with his work, he returned to find Dragunin standing on his feet. The commissioner's pupils had turned yellow. His hands were covered in thick black fur, sideburns had grown out, and his nose had taken on a more animalistic shape. Basil was initially startled, but then realized Dragunin must still be in control, even in his altered state. "You haven't fully transformed." "There's no need for that yet. In the beginning, I would transform completely as soon as night fell, but over time, I accepted the wolf's essence and can now restrain it. I've only let the wolf out enough to heal the wounds." Basil was astonished to find that Dragunin's injuries were indeed gone. He mentioned his own chills and the feverish feeling creeping up, but Dragunin reassured him that it was simply the beast within trying to surface. "Don't take off your locket," he said, "and it'll pass by morning." They waited in their hiding spot for another hour before the Yola arrived. It was pitch dark, and Basil couldn't see a thing, but Dragunin seemed to navigate effortlessly. All Basil could hear were hushed whispers in an unfamiliar language. Then he saw a sudden tear in the darkness, as if it had been cut open with a knife. A dim, bluish light poured from the opening, and shadows slipped inside and vanished. "Stay here," Dragunin commanded. "This isn't your fight. When I'm done, I'll lead you and the survivors back to the city." He darted out of their hiding spot, shifting into the werewolf Basil had seen the night before as he ran. Like the other shadows, he disappeared into the glow, and silence fell. Basil was left alone in the darkness. He reached down and felt something soft beneath his hand. Dragunin's clothes, discarded before his transformation. In the cold, Basil clumsily folded them and set them beside him to take back later. The freezing night wind bit through his coat, so he wrapped himself in Dragunin's jacket to stay warm. An unshakable sense of unease gnawed at him. What if Dragunin couldn't handle it? Basil hadn't gotten a clear look, but there had been at least 10 Yola. The werewolf had barely managed 3 the night before, and Basil had seen firsthand what just one could do. Even a small one like Perugia. Still, the Yola were vulnerable to the werewolf's blood, which offered some hope. But they weren't fools. What if Dragunin needed help? The commissioner had left his pistol and saber behind. But what could human weapons do? Perugia had only died when her head was severed. All Dragunin's other strikes had been ineffective. Basil couldn't just sit there, helpless. His pride wouldn't allow it. He groped in the dark until he found the pistol, saber, and Agzunov's rifle, then crept cautiously toward the glowing rift. The rift was a strange, two-dimensional slice in space, invisible from certain angles. Basil circled it, marveling at the wonders of the world. Science, which had once seemed so engaging, now felt dry and uninspired in comparison. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the rift. On the other side, he found himself in what appeared to be ancient, monumental ruins. Above, a luminous mist swirled like clouds lit by eternal lightning. The walls were adorned with bas-reliefs inscribed with unknown writing and depictions of battles from bygone eras. Basil moved forward down a broken stone corridor, his footsteps echoing loudly. The glowing mist provided enough light to see, but the Yola were fast and dangerous. Who knew when one might leap from the shadows? He checked Aksunov's rifle. It had one shot left. That would have to do. Raising the rifle, Basil pressed on. From somewhere ahead came the sounds of heavy thuds, cries, scraping, groaning, and animalistic growls. The fight was in full swing. Basil dashed forward, reasoning that the Yola were too preoccupied to notice him. Soon the tunnel opened into a vast, high-ceilinged hall. At its center stood a massive marble table surrounded by equally imposing chairs. In the far left corner, a colossal tree grew directly out of the stone floor, its canopy disappearing into the glowing mist above. Around its thick roots lay headless human bodies, with severed heads scattered haphazardly nearby. Basil couldn't tell if they were Yola or their captives. The werewolf commissioner was locked in combat with 4 creatures that scarcely resembled humans anymore. Their elongated limbs made them seem grotesque and disproportionate. Triangular ears like those of Jerboas protruded from their heads. Rows of sharp teeth had replaced their human ones. Their skin had turned gray, and their blood-filled eyes gleamed menacingly. Yet Basil could still discern traces of their former humanity. He even recognized 2 of them: Bulakin, a visiting engineer, and Totsky, a teacher. When Basil's gaze landed on the 3rd Yola, a chill ran down his spine, as if death had passed dangerously close. His current superior, Dr. Ringo Daimirov, was among them. Just this morning, they'd been having a calm conversation about how to break the werewolf's curse by killing it and burning its heart. Now Basil understood why Daimirov had supported his idea of going into the forest with the 3 soldiers last night. The werewolf fought desperately, fending off the Yola that kept leaping onto his back. They slashed at him with their claws, while he tried to snap at them with his jaws, but his teeth only met empty air. Basil could see that Dragunin was struggling. He was severely wounded, and his injuries weren't healing. Only later did Basil notice the silver knife in Bulakin's hand, which left small but effective cuts on the werewolf. Basil pressed himself against the wall. Could he do anything to help the commissioner? Shooting a Yola with the rifle wouldn't kill it, but it might buy some time. The creatures moved quickly, striking and then darting away before Dragunin's powerful jaws and claws could catch them. If the commissioner could take out even one of them, the fight would shift in his favor. Bulakin seemed the best target. He had the knife. Summoning his courage, Basil raised the rifle and stepped into the passageway, trying to aim. No, it was impossible. The Yola moved too fast. Basil realized with horror that the only way to help would be to join the fight himself. But in the chaos, he'd surely be torn apart. As he hesitated, Dragunin sank his teeth into Totsky's neck, ripping off his head with a powerful tug. But at that moment, Bulakin leaped onto the werewolf's back and drove the knife into him. Dragunin roared in pain and spun violently, throwing the monster off. Despite the knife protruding from his back and the blood streaming from numerous wounds, he attacked the remaining Yola with renewed ferocity, scattering them in fear. Basil noticed too late that Dr. Daimirov was charging straight toward him. He ducked into the shadows behind the wall just in time to avoid being seen. Daimirov rushed past him and disappeared. Meanwhile, a 4th, unfamiliar Yola jumped onto Dragunin's back, pulled out the knife and stabbed him several more times. The commissioner managed to throw the creature off, slam it to the ground, tear off its arms, and bite off its head. Bulakin had vanished, likely fleeing through another passage. The battle was over. Exhausted, the werewolf staggered to the table, leaned against it, and then collapsed onto the floor beside it. Basil scanned the room, saw no immediate threat, and rushed to help. He quickly assessed Dragonen's injuries and realized there was no hope. The commissioner had suffered too many cuts and lost too much blood. In Dragunen's yellow, wolfish eyes, Basil saw bitterness and sorrow. Tears welled in his own eyes as he understood he could do nothing for the man he had grown to respect so deeply in a single day. Now Basil knew the truth. The werewolf was indeed a protector. He had seen with his own eyes how fiercely Dragunen had fought the monsters that preyed on the people of Nakhtumirsk. And now, with a heavy heart, he watched as the commissioner's tears mingled with his labored, dying breaths. With his last strength, Dragonen raised a hand to point at his chest, near his heart, and then at his mouth. Basil understood the gesture and wanted to object, but it was too late. Dragonen's breathing slowed and then stopped. His eyes lost their focus, glazing over as they stared into eternal emptiness. Basil let his tears flow freely. Was this the end? The captives appeared to be dead, and 2 Yola had escaped. Dragunen had sacrificed his life, but failed to achieve his goal. The monsters still lived, and Nakhtumirsk had no defender left. Sure, Basil now knew who among the townsfolk were Yola, but what of it? He didn't have the courage to kill them, knowing their strength. And he couldn't convince the townspeople that their neighbors were man-eating monsters. They'd think him mad. Basil Rykov could do nothing. The idea of taking Dragonen's place terrified him. The thought of turning into a beast each night, fighting monsters, and ultimately dying from their claws, like the commissioner, was unbearable. He could forget all of this, drink himself into oblivion, and continue working under Damirov as if nothing had happened. But every night he'd tremble in fear, wondering when the Yola would come for him. But that wasn't his path. As he knelt by his fallen comrade, tears streaming down his face, Basil understood he couldn't abandon the people to their fate. He had been destined from birth to serve Tendris, and now the moon god demanded he step up to protect Nakhtumirsk. Selflessness, Basil thought. That is Tendris's mark. He wiped his tears, rose, and walked to the bodies lying by the tree in the corner. Here were the real Totsky and the unknown man. But when Basil saw the other corpses, his heart nearly stopped. They were children. 5 decapitated children. Among them was Puruja Agzunov. The stench of decay and rot filled the air, and their torn abdomens spilled entrails, tangled among the blood-soaked roots. Basil's chills grew stronger, his fever worsening, and his body weakening. Yet he knelt before the bodies and picked up one of the heads, examining it closely. A boy about 12 years old. So young, yet already a victim of these monsters. Basil thought he recognized the boy. Tainin? He vaguely remembered him from a checkup, but scrutinized the face carefully, committing every feature to memory. Then he moved to the next head. One by one, Basil memorized them all. Now he knew whom to look for in the town, but many hadn't come to tonight's feast, which meant others in Nakhtumirsk were also Yola. Damirov's body wasn't here, after all. Well, Basil thought, the fight isn't over yet. Basil returned to the werewolf's body, picked up the silver knife lying nearby, and steeled himself. With trembling hands, he cut into the beast's chest, carefully extracting the lifeless heart. A nauseating stench filled his nostrils, and he fought the urge to retch. Summoning his resolve, he bit into it with all his strength. The moment the first chewed piece reached his stomach, Basil's mind was flooded with visions of the ancient war between Tendris and the Yola. He saw the lives of past werewolves, inherited their spirits and wills, and was consumed by their rage. Their knowledge and experience poured into him, giving him the strength to continue their battle. When the heart was gone, Basil stripped himself bare, leaving only his silver locket. For a final time he touched it with his fingers, feeling a faint electric tingle. Opening it, he gazed upon Vicinia's face, beautiful as always, beautiful and forever out of reach. Goodbye, be happy. He tore the locket from his neck and cast it aside. Instantly his body began to transform. Hair sprouted over his skin, which stretched and thickened. His fingers widened, claws grew from his nails, and his hands and feet reshaped into wolfish paws. Though he remained upright, he knew he could move faster on all fours. His senses sharpened as his face extended into a snout. Basil Rieckhoff ceased to exist. The werewolf had returned. The world transformed around him. Sounds became sharp and distinct, smells vivid and layered. Colors faded, but shapes stood out starkly even in darkness. Basil bolted for the exit, marveling at the ease with which his new form moved. In one bound, he cleared several yards. When he reached the stone tunnel's end, the dimensional rift behind him sealed itself, closing like a healed wound. But Basil no longer cared. His heart burned with hatred, his every instinct screaming for vengeance against the Yola. He couldn't rest until every last one was destroyed. The journey back to Noctimursk was effortless. His powerful limbs plowed through snowdrifts like feathers, and he vaulted over fallen trees with ease. What had taken hours before now took half the time. As the first houses appeared in the distance, a loud command rang out. Fire! Gunshots echoed, and Basil felt a sharp pain in his shoulder that quickly faded. Reload! Faster! Another volley followed, this time hitting his chest. Basil staggered, wheezing for a moment, but soon the pain subsided. Then he heard a voice, Bullekin's. It was clear and distinct amid the cacophony of gunfire, shouting and stomping feet. With a ferocious roar, Basil charged toward the sound, plowing into the line of armed Noctimursk townsfolk. Soldiers and hunters froze in fear, their faces pale with near-superstitious terror. Basil ignored them, focusing on the bitter, rotting scent of the Yola. He leapt at Bullekin, who tried to dodge, but the werewolf's jaws clamped down on his neck. In front of a dozen horrified onlookers, Basil ripped off Bullekin's head and tossed it aside. He let out a roar so powerful that it silenced the crowd, their hearts seemingly stopping in their chests. Now it was Demirov's turn. Basil tore toward the doctor's home, ignoring the shouted commands behind him. Another round of gunfire followed, but the bullets missed, whistling past his ears. Basil knew how this looked. A monstrous beast ripping a townsman apart. But after witnessing the horrors the Yola committed, he couldn't allow even one of them to exist. His only goal was to destroy them all. The werewolf smashed through Demirov's gate, tearing it from its hinges, and barreled into the house. He moved through the narrow corridor with ease, guided by his sharpened senses. Demirov was sitting in a chair in one of the cramped rooms. As soon as he saw the beast, he hissed and lunged, claws aiming for Basil's throat. Basil dodged, biting into Demirov's arm and tearing it off. In the next instant, he tore off the doctor's head as well. A quick career move, Basil thought grimly. Jumping through the window, he found the townsfolk already gathered outside, weapons at the ready. He didn't wait for them to shoot, darting away before they could fire. The hardest task lay ahead, entering 4 homes to kill the children. After this, no one would ever forgive him, but he had no choice. Every moment of hesitation would lead to more human deaths, and every mistake would carry a heavy price. Basil raced through the town, weaving through the maze of homes and alleys to lose his pursuers. He quickly found the first house, leaping through a window to find the small demon child. Without hesitation, he bit off its head. The second house was guarded by the boy's family. Basil pushed past them, reaching his target. The third and fourth homes were easier. He used the same method, jumping through windows to dispatch the young Yola swiftly. Each kill left him haunted by the memories of the real children, their severed heads, their gruesome final moments. He heard the monstrous screams of the dying Yola, and imagined the heartbreak their parents would feel when they discovered what he had done. Yet even this was better than what the Yola had done to their real children. Basil left the fourth house and headed toward Norvund, but the voices of townsfolk reached him again. A shot rang out, and searing pain lanced through his shoulder. This time, it didn't fade. Silver. Someone had taught the townsfolk to use silver. Basil fled in panic, the angry cries of the townspeople echoing behind him. "Don't let him escape!" Basil kept running, blindly pushing forward. Pain pulsed through his torn shoulder, and drops of his blood splattered onto the snow, leaving a clear trail for his hunters to follow. The voices behind him gradually faded into the distance. He leapt over a fallen tree, changed direction, and trudged on. His vision began to blur. He'd lost too much blood. Each step became harder than the last, until finally he came to a halt and collapsed into the snowbank. He lay on his back, staring up at the moonless night sky as soft snowflakes drifted down onto his muzzle. He wanted to die. Killing children, even if they were monsters, was too much to bear. To carry the weight of universal hatred, to spend his life in endless battles against the Yola. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps nearby broke through the quiet. Basil was too exhausted to care. If it was a hunter, he wished they would just shoot him and end it all. But when a familiar face loomed over him, that of the shaman Mogai, he felt a deep guttural urge to howl in despair. "Praise to you, warrior of Tendris," Mogai said, his voice calm and reverent. "Hold on, I'll help you." With those words, the shaman grasped Basil's massive forepaw and, using all his strength, began dragging him through the snow. "My hut isn't far. I'll give you special herbs. Treat and bandage your wounds. You'll rest for a couple of days and regain your strength." Basil closed his eyes, surrendering to fate. "Don't despair, warrior. Very soon you'll be ready to continue your service to the great Tendris.